Have you ever thought about your thoughts? I mean, have you ever thought about what goes through your brain on a regular basis? Is there something there? Is there nothing there? You know, a lot of people think men just focus on, food, sex, and maybe sleep. There's thoughts of what people have in their brains, and sometimes men get kind of disparaged. They say, well, men don't have much going through their brain. But the reality is we have a lot of thoughts going through our brain and how we think it's important as men. You see, mental health is not like physical health. We often don't see the negatives. If you're having issues with your physical health, it's pretty easy to see. If your knee gives out, you can't walk, you limp, you do things like that. If your shoulder's hurting, you can't move your arm, you can't have full range of motion. All those things happen. But sometimes when our brain begins to atrophy or get weakened, no one sees it. Nobody knows unless it's something very serious. And that's the whole thing with our brains. A lot of times we don't really think about what's going on up there. And if our brains aren't functioning at full capacity, a lot of times we just get used to it. But there are things we can do as men to protect our minds and to keep them fresh, to keep them moving and growing. And as men, that is key for our own growth and for our influence on others. If we want to make a difference in this world, if we want to make a difference in our relationships, our minds are the key. So let's figure out how to keep our minds fresh on today's show. Let's jump in.
Welcome to the Confident Man Podcast, empowering men with the confidence they need to live their adventure. Now, here is your host, David Maxwell.
Hey guys, welcome to the Confident Man Podcast. I'm so glad you joined me here today. And listen, you are growing. What do you mean I'm growing? How do I know I'm growing? Well, you're listening to this podcast. You're doing something to help yourself. And that's good because as men, we have to make our growth happen. We do. And the only person who can do it is us. So I'm glad you joined me here today. And today we're talking about how to keep our minds fresh. Now, recently I was riding my bike on a road near here called the Natchez Trace Parkway. It's a great place to ride. There's not a lot of traffic. You just feel safer when you're on a bike. I was doing a 40-mile ride, so it was a long ride. So I had a lot of time to just kind of look around and see what was going on. One thing I saw, dead animals. Because there's a dead animal somewhere off when you see a bunch of the buzzards flying around, they're eating it, the crows, they're just taking care of business. So it's kind of funny when you see that. But also, I was right by the reservoir and I saw a bunch of boats. It was a Saturday, a bunch of people were out boating, and I saw this one boat. I've never wanted to boat because of all the work that's involved with them, but there was a houseboat this one family had, and it was beautiful. It was huge. They were sitting on top on the porch area. They had a place off the back where the kids could swim. It was in this inlet, and I was like, okay, if I ever got stupid money, that's what I would get. But also as I rode, there were people fishing. They're on the side of the reservoir fishing, and I went past where the reservoir was on out, and I saw this one guy who I noticed as I was pulling up on my bike. He was fishing. But he was faced on the inside, and the reservoir was about 4 or 5 miles down the other way. And he was fishing in this stagnant pond. And I just thought to myself, are you that desperate to fish? Plus, do you really want the fish that are in a stagnant pond? And it's just funny because stagnant water is just kind of gross. If you've ever been around it, it's not fun. You don't want to swim in it. You don't want to get in it. But a lot of men today struggle with what I call a stagnant mind. And that means they have a mind that's just kind of there. There's no new input or output. It just kind of exists. And what happens with these men a lot of times is they get into the cycle of life where they're going on the routine. It's the same thing every day, and it gets dangerous. Because for a lot of men, we get into autopilot syndrome where our brains are just on autopilot. We're just kind of doing the same thing over and over. And that's the danger of routine, to where we get so much into our routine, our brain just kind of shuts off. And what happens is our brains atrophy. And that means they get kind of weak. They don't stay fresh. If we don't challenge our minds, they won't grow. And that's just a fact. Your brain is like a muscle. It's not a muscle, but it acts like a muscle in many ways. If you don't use it, you'll lose it. And a lot of times we don't realize it until we don't have the ability to do something. You know, if you've ever gone to physical therapy, a lot of times they have you work muscles that you weren't working. You didn't realize you weren't working, and you didn't even realize you had muscles there. And you start waking that muscle up, and it's hard. That's why a lot of people don't like physical therapy, because it focuses on that muscle. And what we need to do as men is focus on our minds to make sure our mind is staying fresh and active. And that doesn't happen by accident. You don't just accidentally work your mind, just like you don't accidentally work a muscle. It only happens with intentionality. We've got to be intentional about the things we do. So we're going to talk about that today. 3 areas we need to be intentional in. We need to be intentional in our input, intentional in our contemplation, and intentional in our thermostat. You can increase your worth as a man. You really can. It's not some number you're stuck with when you were born, or it has to do with where you grew up, where you went to school, or anything like that. You can be a man who gets better and better, which means you can increase your worth in every area of your life. Now, sometimes that seems hard because the schedule of life can be just overwhelming. You feel like it's hard to get ahead and you're living in survivor mode all the time. And you think maybe you're just doomed to be a side character while all the other guys are playing the lead. And that's not true. I'm David Maxwell, and my journey as a man began almost 30 years ago. My son was born, and I realized I didn't know anything about how to be a dad. And then I started looking, and I really wasn't a great husband, really wasn't a great man. So I started a journey of learning what it means to be a man. And on that journey that's been happening, I've grown, and I've also helped lots of other men grow. And I want to help you grow. I want to help you become a high-value man. That's why I've designed the High Value Intensive. It's designed for you to increase your worth as a man. You put the right focus, the right effort, you can grow your worth as a man. And what happens when you grow your worth as a man? You grow your worth to yourself, you grow your worth to women, you grow your worth at work, and you grow your worth to the world. Each intensive will be around 2.5 to 3 hours, and they'll include teachings, worksheets, interaction, Q&A, everything you need to increase your worth as a man. We've condensed it down to one day. That way you can get it done, get growing, and move on with your life. Now, the intensive is limited in number, so we can have plenty of time to talk, to interact, and to kind of work through everything. So make sure you sign up early, because once the classes are full, there's no more entry. You can increase your worth as a man. What's a couple hours for you to increase your worth? It's like watching a movie, and I believe you can do it. You can be a better man. You can be a high-value man. For more information, go to theconfidentman.me. Everything you need to know is there. And hey, if you use the code podcast, you'll get $50 off. So make sure to use that code podcast when you go to theconfidentman.me. That's theconfidentman.me. The first thing we want to talk about when it comes to keeping our minds fresh is having intentional input. Now, earlier I said the phrase, use it or lose it. And that really is a phrase that fits our brain. It fits what we do. Now, of course, that mostly deals with the physical, but it really should fit with the mental. And sometimes we don't realize how little we're using our minds, how easy it is to get in that state where you just kind of do the same thing over and over. That was kind of brought out to me recently. I'm reading a book called Built to Move, and it's a book that deals with these 10 things that help you kind of gain balance and all these other things that around the world are considered kind of the standards of just basic health. And as you get older, they get more and more important. And one of them was about balance and how important balance is. And I thought, okay, I got balance pretty good. Well, they had this balance test. And what was funny is they have you stand there and stand on one foot. And I thought, I got this. I can stand on one foot all day. Well, I stood on one foot. Then they have you close your eyes. And I thought, well, that's no big deal. What's the difference? As soon as I closed my eyes, I started to fall. I mean, as soon. It was like, close, oh no. And it just happened. I was horrible. And it helped me to realize, okay, I'm not as good at balance as I thought I am. And so they got some exercises in there I'm starting to do just to work on my balance so I can maintain that as I get older. And sometimes I think we need those things in our brains. So what about your mind? Where do you think you are? If I was to ask you the question, what are you doing to intentionally grow your mind? What would you say? A lot of guys would answer, Dave, okay, that's great, but I'm busy. I got too much to do. That's a bad sign. It really is. If we don't intentionally work our minds, they're going to lose their full potential. They're going to lose the ability to really help us. And you use your mind all the time. But if you don't use it well, you're not going to be able to think as clearly as you could, and you're not going to be as good as you could be. If we don't work our minds, they will weaken. We won't think as clear. No input makes our brain stagnant. It makes it lazy. We lose the ability to think, and we just kind of go with the flow. And a lot of guys, when that happens, they aren't open to new ideas. They aren't open to new thoughts. Why? Because that's too much work, because their brains have gotten lazy. So let's talk about some intentional things we can do to kind of refresh our brain. Some intentional input that we can do. I want to talk about just a few of them to help you think through it. The first one is reading. Now, you hear people all the time, you need to read. Readers are leaders and things like that. Because the act of reading is active for your brain. It's different from just sitting and watching something. When you read, you're actually engaged in your mind. And when I say read, I mean all kinds of stuff. You should read nonfiction, books that help you, that build you up, books about history, books about all kinds of stuff. But you should also read fiction, because that engages a different part of your brain. And it kind of brings your imagination. And you can read, you can listen to the books, you can use a Kindle. It doesn't matter how you do it. You just want to read. You just want to put that information in. Now, I used to have this guilt trip about reading stuff where I would think, okay, I'm reading, but I'm not remembering everything. And so I would read less, thinking I should really focus and try to remember everything. Well, here's the point. Reading just sharpens you. It sharpens your brains. Don't try to remember everything. Just keep reading. Keep inputting that data, and your brain will stay fresher. It'll stay stronger. You want to find what works for you. Like, you may prefer reading an actual paper book, sitting in a room with some music playing or whatever. You may prefer listening to a book. You may do all of them. I do all three. I listen to books. In fact, I love listening to fiction. It's kind of my favorite way to kind of read fiction books, stories. It gets my imagination going while I'm doing something that's, I don't really have to think about it. I'm driving in the car, or I'm cleaning the house, or doing an odd job around that in the garage. I can listen to a fiction book. But I also like to read actual books, to sit down and read and think through. And I have a Kindle. I love Kindles because you can highlight real easy on a Kindle. So a lot of times I'll read a lot of nonfiction books on my Kindle too. So those are different things you can do to input into yourself. And when it comes to watching something, you can input new ways that way. Watch something different. There's all kinds of stuff out there you can do. You can watch documentaries. You can watch an online course that's free. You can watch things that are outside your normal routine. Sometimes that'll challenge you. A lot of us are guilty of just watching the same old thing all the time. And I want to challenge you to think different. Try new stuff. Challenge your thinking. Even a new show will get you to think differently. A new style of movie that you've never watched. But there's tons of stuff. There's lots of free things just sitting there on YouTube that you could watch that actually help you, instead of it just being mindless entertainment. So try watching some new stuff. You can also try new routines. New routines force you to think different. And I've talked about this recently, where I started trying to brush my teeth with my opposite hand for a while, just to see how hard it was. It was really hard. I had to really think about it. And so it's one of those things that you're like, okay, this is a new routine, and it kind of forced my brain to think differently. Now I'm doing some of the built to move stuff while I brush my teeth. It's 2 minutes every day. I can do stuff. And so I do those things while I'm brushing my teeth, so I remember them. I'm kind of putting them together, and it's just a new routine that helps me. You can also do something with a new hobby. Find a new hobby. Try a new hobby. Even if you don't end up loving it, just trying it will expand your mind. Maybe you try doing puzzles. Maybe you try crossword. Maybe you try doing a new physical hobby, going hiking, or going running, or riding bikes, or different things like that. Try something new that maybe you've never done before, and it'll stretch your mind. You can also try new things like listening to new music. All of us are guilty of having our decade. The music was best in this decade. Just like I'm an 80s apologist. I love 80s music. It's kind of, I grew up in the 80s, so it's like 80s music's the best. And it's funny because each generation talks about how their music is the best, and they decry all the other generations. And there's nothing wrong with that. But don't be afraid to try new music. Don't just listen to the same old songs all the time. Try something new. My daughter got me about 5 years ago listening to K-pop, and I loved it. And I've listened to tons of it. I know way more about K-pop than I should. And it was something new. It was something fresh. So try those things just to freshen up your mind. You can also hang out with new people. Spend some time with people you haven't hung out with before. Go out to dinner with new friends. Try to make some new friends. Get involved in things centered around new people. All of these things will help keep your brain fresh. And with that, try new events. Go to a concert you've not gone to before. Look in your city for free events you can go to. Those kind of things will kind of challenge you and push you and help you. The point is to do something. Do something intentional. I just threw out a bunch of stuff. And you could pick one or two of those and start this weekend. But you want to start with something. Do something that kind of freshens your brain up. And what that is that's intentional input. You don't want to try to do everything at once. Just start with one thing. Start trying something new. It'll stimulate your mind and you'll find yourself growing more than you can imagine. The second thing we want to talk about when it comes to keeping our minds fresh is intentional contemplation. Now, contemplation is a word I use a lot, and it basically is talking about deep thinking. I believe men should take the mantle of deep thinking back. Men are deep thinkers, they just are. And today we've allowed society to kind of put us down as men and make us feel like we're just walking bags of hormones, and we're not. Men are deep thinkers. They've always been deep thinkers, and we should do it with intentionality. We should approach our deep thinking with intentionality. We should believe that we can be deep thinkers, and we should be. You say, well, Dave, come on. I'm not a guy who just sits around and thinks deep thoughts. What if you were? What if you were a guy who did sit around and think deep thoughts? You could be. All it takes is you being intentional about it. I'm not saying you're going to solve the world's problems during your deep thoughts. But you know what? When you contemplate and think about your own life, you'll live a better life because you'll think deeper about your relationships, who you are, how you work, things like that. And you'll come up with new thoughts and new patterns that you didn't even know were there. So what we need to do is talk about some things we can do to improve our deep thoughts, to intentionally do it. The first one is we can find an overall mindset. Finding an overall mindset is important. So let me ask you, what mindset do you live with? What kind of mindset do you have? Now, a lot of guys, when they hear that, like, what are you talking about? I'm busy. I got stuff to do. I got to get stuff done. I'm working 12-hour shifts. I got a house to take care of. I got kids to raise. I don't know what you're talking about with this overall mindset. Well, the danger of that is men who get so busy and weighed down with the stress and the busyness of life, they don't have an overall mindset. And then when they get some downtime, all they do is veg out. All they do is run away. They go to social media, they go to entertainment, all of these things, and those can become a drug to our mind. And what happens is those guys will end up being their own mindset. It's all about me. It's all about my comfort. It's all about what I want. And that's just not good for men. If we don't intentionally choose our mindset, we end up becoming selfish. We end up becoming our own purpose. And we just kind of numb ourselves with entertainment. We numb ourselves with things that we want. And that's not good for us as men. Our life won't have real purpose outside of ourselves. We do better when we live for a purpose greater than ourselves. When you have an overall mindset, when you have kind of a purpose to your life that's greater than yourself, you're going to have a richer life. You're going to have a better life. And what we want to do as men is learn to think deeply. And one of the ways we do that is decide, what's my overall mindset? Why do I exist? Why am I here? What is my purpose? When you discover those things, you'll discover a greater life than you would have had than just making bills, making payments, doing stuff. That's just not good for us as men. The other thing we want to do is find ways to challenge our thoughts. Now, challenging our thoughts can come with the intentional inputs that we talked about earlier. All of those challenge your thoughts. But I want to talk about intentionally challenging your thoughts, which means digging into harder things for your brain. We do want new intentional inputs. When's the last time you did something that was hard? When did you read a book that maybe was a little ahead of where you're at? Or was a book about something that you just don't think much about, so it's challenging your thinking? I'm reading a book that I got recently called Super Abundance, and the authors are making the case that as our population grows, our resources are growing. That it's the opposite of what most people think. Most people think the more people we have, the less resources we're going to have. And they make a great case that because we have more people who think, and more people who invent, and more people who come up with things. And they show, study after study, as the population has grown, our resources have grown. We've actually gotten richer as a society. Well, that challenges the way I think. It challenges what I'm doing. So I want to ask you, don't be afraid to challenge your mind. Learn something new. Read a book about something you've never really thought about. Try and play an instrument. Try and learn a new language. Learn a dance. Even the latest TikTok craze dance or whatever will push your mind. Or just learn some new tech stuff. It's not that you're going to become an expert in any of these things. Just the fact of trying to learn a new language can help your brain grow and expand. Even if you never get beyond a kindergarten or level of the language, your brain will grow and expand, and it will be challenging to you. And you want to also find time for deep focus. Deep focus is something a lot of men don't get today. We have all these conveniences and things, and yet we seem to have less time. Whenever we do have a quiet moment, we fill it with our phones. We just kind of go with it. That's something that's always plagued mankind. When you read old writers, you'll see that they complained about the same thing. They talked about how busy everybody is. They talked about the dangers of new technology. And this is like in the 1800s. The point is, we don't want to complain. We don't want to blame. We just want to make time to have our own deep focus. Try to find ways to unplug. Maybe for you, it's walking in the woods. Maybe it's driving with classical music or soundtrack music. That's one of my favorites. If I want to have some time to just think or create, I'll drive. And when I'm driving, I'll put soundtrack music on. And there's just something about that. It challenges my mind and I can think deeper. Maybe for you, it's praying or reading or meditating in the morning. The point is to slow down and really think through life. If you don't think through life, you'll just live life and you'll just exist and you won't have a purpose. You won't have meaning and your life won't be as rich as it could be. Men have to learn how to be deep again. Men should learn how to contemplate. And we do this intentionally. When we do it intentionally through contemplation, we're going to be much better men. All right, the third thing we want to talk about is our intentional thermostat. And you say, what do you mean intentional thermostat? That's a little weird. Well, I'm using the thermostat to talk about kind of the internal temperature of our brain, not the literal temperature, but what we're doing to set the tone for our brain. We all understand the thermostat. We all understand the thermostat battle in a house, how people want the house either cold or hot or whatever. You know, you may have gone, like we used to go to one of our relatives and they always kept the house hot. And they always do. And it was one of those things you're like, okay, we need to be ready for this. We bring fans. You wear almost nothing when you're sleeping at night because it was just so warm. Because they were one of those people that are always cold. And what you want to do as a man is set the temperature of your brain. In other words, you set what goes on in your brain. Just like now, you can set your house temperature with a thermostat, but there are even beds out there. You can set your side of the bed and make it a specific temperature. It's amazing what happens. You know, for me, I like sleeping in a cold room. I want the room to be cold. I can use blankets. I like that. During the winter, I'm thriving. However, during the summer, in order to make it cold, you got to crank that AC down. I don't like paying the AC bill. So I find ways to work around it in the summer. But what you want to do is find those things that set your thermostat. We understand it. So what we want to do is set the temperature of our brain. We want to do things to protect our brain, to make it to where it's best, where we can function the best way. So I want you to think about it as a thermostat because we have to control our minds. We're the ones who control our thought process. And if we don't control them, we're giving that control to someone else. And as men, I want to challenge us to control our own minds. And we do this by focusing on a few key areas. One of them is just our own mental health. What are you doing to take care of yourself mentally in a healthy way? What are you doing to relieve the stress in your life? What are you doing to where you're not just living stress after stress? That's not good for you. It's not good for your body. It's not good for your brain. What are you doing to take breaks? What are you doing to kind of get away from everything? We talked about some of the input things earlier. Some of those could help you deal with your stress. Maybe working out is something you need to incorporate into your life. One of the things you can do for your mental health is take care of your physical health, because the stress that you feel in your life when you work out physically, a lot of times it deals with that stress and you feel better. Things like your diet. Your diet affects your mental health. If you're jumped up on caffeine all the time, can't function without it, well, that's not good. You may need to look at some different things you can do. Hydration is very important for your brain, making sure you drink enough water. People you hang around. Sometimes we hang around people that aren't good for our mental health, and we may need to move on. We're the ones who set a healthy temperature for our brain. So your mental health is something you have to take care of. And sometimes that may mean getting some help, getting someone to help you learn how to think properly. Maybe you grew up in a home that wasn't healthy, so you're not sure how to do that. Well, there's books you can read, there's counselors you can go to. All of those people can help you learn how to watch over your mental health. And that's you setting the thermostat of your brain. So don't run away from it. Do it so your brain can function at its best. You also want to look at your attitudes. What's your base attitude in life? Do you tend to be more of a pessimist or an optimist? Or are you somewhere in between? This is where you can challenge yourself by finding out about yourself. What's your personality? Why are you the way you are? There's all kinds of tests and things you can do out there. The Enneagram, the 16 personalities, there's all kinds. And each one of those comes at a different angle, and it helps you realize, oh, this is why I think like I do. I just did something recently with Patrick Lencioni's The Working Geniuses. And it was so cool to look at it and say, this is why when I work, I tend to want to do these things. And it was an amazing thing for me to see. All of those are designed to do that. The more you do, the more you learn about yourself, the more you learn about how you think, what you do. And that helps you just kind of understand life. It also helps you to understand why you set your brain at certain temperatures, why you are the way you are. It's just like in your house. If you as a man, you're 6 foot, you're 240, you want a cold house because you tend to be warm. But let's say your wife is 5'4" and like 130 or 140. She wants a warmer house because she's cold all the time. Well, that's because of your size difference, the way you are. And that just happens to everybody. When you understand your brain, when you understand the way you think, it helps you to understand why you let the thermostat be at a specific place. And that's good to know. It's good for you to know that. It's good for the way you think. And we also set the internal temperature of our brain through what we put in. Now, earlier I talked about putting new things in our brain, and that's good. But we want to think about what are we putting in our brain regularly, kind of like a diet. Some things that we can watch or listen to or do, and maybe we need to do those in more moderation. We need to control it. Where if every time you sit down to watch something on Netflix and you binge watch 10 shows, that may not be the best thing for your brain. You're going to kind of turn into a vegetable doing that. So maybe you treat it like a diet. You do it in moderation. And then some things you just may need to cut out entirely. There's a lot of addictive entertainment out there that people get into. A lot of the social media channels are there to get you addicted, to kind of focus and kind of control you. A lot of guys are so caught up in porn, they can't break it. They can't pull away from it. Those things need to be cut out. Just like if you're eating something that's hurting you, you need to cut it out. And that's what we have to do with our brain. That's how we set the thermostat temperature of our brain. There's some things we probably just need to stop doing. And then what do you put in that affects your overall attitude? You have to protect your mind because nobody else will do it. In ancient times, they had cities with walls around them, and those walls were there for protection, to protect the city. And you want to think about your brain having a wall around it. You're the one who picks what goes in and what goes out. And you want to be careful about that because you want your brain to function the best. If you sit there for 2 hours scrolling on TikTok, well, that's not the best thing for your brain. So maybe you need to do some things to limit that time, to say, I'm only going to look at it when I'm doing this or when I'm doing that. Or just even be aware, set a timer when you get on there. I'm going to look for the next 5 minutes. Well, set a timer on your phone. So when 5 minutes is up, it cuts off and okay, I need to get back to doing something else. A lot of guys I've seen sit there on their phone and they can't stop playing games. Their wall is kind of crumbled down. You want to build your wall strong. You want to protect your your brain. You want to protect what goes on, the thermostat. And you do that by watching the input you put in. As men, we set the thermostat for our brains. And we have to do it intentionally or we won't live our best life. All right, gentlemen, closing out the show today, we need to remember that as men, our minds are incredible. And we need to train them so we can use them at the best. We can use them the way they were designed. Your brain is really your greatest muscle. It is. Everything flows through your brain. And what we want to do is focus it and use it to make a positive difference. We want to think about our intentional input. What are we putting into our brain? Our intentional contemplation. What are we doing to think deep? And the intentional thermostat. What are we doing to set the temperature of our brain and to protect our brain? We've got to steward our minds or we're going to lose our ability to make a positive difference in the world. See, the last thing we want to be is the man who's that bag of hormones that we see in TV and in the movies. We don't want to be that. We can be different as men. We can be men of fresh minds, and all of it can start today.
You've been listening to the Confident Man Podcast. Click subscribe so you don't miss a future episode. You can connect with David on Facebook and Instagram at David the Maxwell. Find resources to help you as a man at theconfidentman.me. That's theconfidentman.me.